All right. So, lesson 11. We get things started. The Gilded Age and the Second Industrial Revolution. Really famous political cartoon and cartoonist here. It is entitled Bosses of the Senate by Joseph Kepler from 1889. What are these big bags of money representing?
Big barons.
Yeah, the robber barons. Very good. Big business, monopolies, trusts. So we have the Steel Beam Trust, Copper Trust, Standard Oil. We got coal down here. They're in control of the Senate. They and their lobbyists. Bless you. What is closed? What's this area up here meant for? Does anybody know what this area above the Senate is called? That's good. It is kind of the nosebleeds. It's called the gallery. This is where the people can come be a part of the political process. And check it out. The gallery is closed. The people's entrance is closed. This is the epitome of the era of the Gilded Age. Did I have this exercise earlier with everybody where I said, how many people can name a tycoon? Did I do this before? How many people can name a tycoon or a robber baron from the late 1800s, early 1900s? Rockefeller? Vanderbilt? Very good. Anybody else? Any other ones out there? Ford? Very good. Nice. Any others? Anybody remember a guy by the name of Carnegie? Yeah. Anybody J.P. Morgan? Here's my next question. Can anyone out there name a president between Rutherford B. Hayes and Teddy Roosevelt? I love the facial expressions. That's what I'm looking for. Anybody? Before Rutherford B. Hayes. Taft was after. That was a good guess, though. See, that's what I'm saying. Like, this is an era where we can remember after. This is an era where we can remember after, but not in between. We remember before, we can remember after. What do we got?
James Abram Garfield.
Yes, Garfield for sure. Not the lasagna-loving cat, but the president. All right. All right. Okay, so the Gilded Age. We're going to talk about Garfield today. The Gilded Age, novel co-authored by Mark Twain and Charles W. Warner. Its true title is The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. The term basically meant that times looked good on the surface, yet if you scratch the surface, it was tarnished. And it's a perfect metaphor for this time in America, in politics, economics, and in American society. There are very, very few haves and a whole lot of have-nots, okay? This is an era filled with corruption, very close elections at local, state, and the federal level, and a lot of fundamental differences. A big fundamental difference in this era is economics. Not everybody can totally get on the same page with how America should move forward economically once the country comes back together. Also, as I previously mentioned before, we're going to see both the Republican and the Democratic Party splinter even into greater factions. So, the Democrats, namely conservative Democrats in the South, sometimes referred to as the Dixiecrats, are going to regain control of their local and state governments once the war once Reconstruction ends. A big way that happened was through what was called the Amnesty Act of 1872, which kind of waved a bit of a magic wand to sit across the South to say, you are forgiven. You can have your voting rights back. You can run for political office. We're moving forward. This was actually signed into, it was proposed by the 42nd Congress and signed into law by Grant. A lot of Republicans hoped that the South wouldn't try to return to any type of status quo, but obviously Jim Crow is on the rise, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. Republicans have a pretty strong voter base, regardless of their factions. They have strong votes in the North and the West. They are carrying the African American vote in this era, and they are also carrying the veteran vote. If you were a veteran of the Union Army, almost overwhelmingly, you were voting Republican, especially if you were tied to what was called the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic. That's one of the big reasons why the Republicans circled their wagons around Grant at the end of Reconstruction. However, we started to see a splinter in the Republican Party in the post-Reconstruction era. One faction, led by a guy named Roscoe Conkling, were called the Stalwarts. And another faction, led by James G. Blaine, were called the Half-Breeds. The radical Republicans are kind of on the outs now. If you're wondering what the half-breeds are in reference to, these are basically like the moderate Republicans. The main division between these two factions, the stalwarts believe that government jobs should be given through patronage or the spoil system, where the half-breeds and the moderates believe that government jobs should be achieved based on merit and qualifications. I know this seems very bizarre, but the battle over government jobs and who would be hired into the government positions in the post-Reconstruction era was very much a big part of the Republican platform, because what is the country doing in this era? Very good. They're recovering and rebuilding. Excellent job. Remember, we talked a little bit about this at the end of the last lesson with Grant. The Panic of 1873, paralyzing economic panic, one of the worst in American history. It all kind of went down with the failure of Jay Cook's bank. He had made a lot of money on the war bond sales during the Civil War. This was catastrophic. 18,000 businesses failed. A lot of those businesses were railroad companies. Unemployment rose to 14%. This is a pretty rough one. This also shows us this is going to be an era of very reckless lending. Once America gets itself out of this panic and comes to an end with Reconstruction and the South retakes control of their governments, we're going to see a vicious battle in both the Republican and the Democratic Party over currency. Conservatives in both camps very much supported the gold standard. Moderates often supported the coinage of silver. And more of your liberals, but some moderates, supported inflationary tactics like printing more greenbacks. This is going to create a constant battle from the presidency of Rutherford B. Hayes all the way to the Great Depression over how the American economy was going to back its dollar and coin its money. I know this seems like really bizarre to us right now, but we're kind of living in like a similar sort of parallel universe in a way, right? Like, what's a type of currency that has come about in our lifetime that goes up and down and up and down? Crypto, right? Yeah? I'm not saying this is like comparable to the age of crypto, but the battles that we see rage over American currency now and regulation of crypto, it's kind of comparable to what we saw with the gold standard, the Silverite Coalition, and the supporters of greenback printing and inflationary tactics. So we're going to talk more about this as we move into this lesson, and it will the currency issue stays with us as we move into the progressive era. This, the father of American humor and satire, is Mark Twain. I'm sure you guys are familiar with some of his work, like The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and among others. He is going to be the author, or co-author rather, of The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. One of my favorite Twain quotes is, "The man who does not read has no advantage over the man who cannot read." It's good words to live by. That is deep. So, Boss Tweed, Tammany Hall. Boss Tweed is arguably the most recognizable and corrupt head of a political machine in America. You all need to understand that politics in this era were corrupt at every level, local, state, federal. We already talked about this in the Grant administration. This guy up here on the left is Boss Tweed, William Tweed, aka Boss Tweed. He was a member of the House of Representatives from New York City. He was a Democrat, and he ran a Democratic political machine out of an organization known as Tammany Hall. They employed bribery, they employed graft, they employed patronage, violence, fake elections, you name it, all right? Do you all understand what graft is? If you don't, it's basically like over speculation of a price of something only to steal the money of the over speculation. So it would be like for me to you guys, hey, we're going to get a contract and it's going to cost $10 million for us to do the work. But we're going to put that it's going to cost $20 million. And if you guys stay quiet about it, we'll all split $10 million. What do you say? And then I pay you guys off to be quiet and help me hatch this scheme. And those payoffs, that's graft. We scrape money off the top. Sometimes we call these kickbacks, not like low-key parties, but money stolen from over speculation. So, on the flip side, not that I'm defending Tweed, I don't think that's appropriate, he did provide some jobs and city improvements in New York. But if you got a job, or you got a house, or a tenement, or whatever, if Tweed did you a favor, what would he expect for you in return from you? All these things. He might expect money. He might expect a favor. He also might expect, would definitely expect, your vote. And this is a period of time where what does not exist at the ballot box yet? There's no secret ballot yet. Very good. So, everybody's going to see how you vote. And if you don't vote the way Tweed tells you to vote, somebody's going to be on the other side of the ballot box ready to club your kneecaps. That's the type of voter intimidation that was used in this era. The journalists that are going to break the story on Tweed are going to be journalists from the New York Times. So he decides to try to flee to Spain. But one of the other people that are instrumental in taking him down is this guy on the top right. That is Thomas Nast. Nast is arguably our most famous American political cartoonist. He's done a lot of really famous cartoons, and some of his most famous were cartoons of Boss Tweed. Why would Tweed be more frustrated by cartoons than news reports?
They're easier to understand.
They're easier to understand, and there's a lot of illiterate people. So he actually tried to bribe Nast to stop the cartoons, but Nast doesn't stop. And ultimately, he'll be captured trying to flee to Spain. He's put on trial. Another important person involved in this is a guy that you've already been introduced to. That's Samuel Tilden. Samuel Tilden, who ran for president against Rutherford B. Hayes, is going to be the prosecutor that takes Tweed down and becomes famous for it. Tweed will later die in Ludlow jail. Bless you. Will this end political corruption in America? No, but it puts it on notice. All right, birth of Jim Crow and the post-Reconstruction South. We've already talked about the passage of black codes in the South in the post-Civil War era. And we've already talked about the military occupation of the South and a period in which African American men not only had the right to vote, but also had the right to be elected to public office. But after the Amnesty Act and after the Compromise of 1877, the Jim Crow laws are going to spread at the local and state level. The main goal of the Jim Crow laws in their infancy is to prevent African Americans from voting and running for political office. So here are some of the Jim Crow laws that are going to be devastating to African Americans in the South and beyond. Literacy tests are required for voting. That's a problem because there's a lot of African Americans still learning to read and write. Voter registration laws emerged, and in some cases, you had to pay to register to vote. Do you have to do that now? Absolutely not. That's illegal. Poll taxes were collected. Poll taxes were such a problem, paying to vote, not only paying to register, but paying to vote, that there is now an amendment to the Constitution that bars poll taxes. Does anybody know what that amendment is? The 24th Amendment banned the poll tax nationwide. There's also the horrible impact of what is called the grandfather clause. This meant that if your grandfather couldn't vote, neither could you. Well, that pretty much knocks most everybody out in the African American community in the South, because nearly every African American in the South grandfather had been enslaved. What other segment of society would be impacted by some of these laws? Sadly, they're not even in the picture. They're totally left out. They have no voting rights yet. Poor whites, people that would be looking for labor rights and voting rights, are also impacted by these Jim Crow laws. So, all of these targeted African American voters. It also helps, at least when you think about the passage of Jim Crow laws on other levels, it also helps usher along those horribly racist systems of sharecropping and tenant farming, which they're not really slavery, they're not really indentured servitude. It's more like what old system in Europe where you were tied to the land but you owned nothing. Feudalism, serfdom, right? Very good. That's kind of what happens in the South. Does the New South industrialize on a major level? Not really. There's pockets of the South that do, but the South still remains agricultural, depending on what two crops yet again. Cotton and tobacco. Very good. Ultimately, Jim Crow laws and black codes are going to be tested in the courts. In 1896, the Supreme Court will hear the case Plessy v. Ferguson. Little background on Plessy. Homer Plessy, well-educated, 1/8 African American, living in New Orleans, community activist in his parish. In 1890, the the state of Louisiana passes a law that makes train cars separate through Jim Crow laws. Whites and African Americans can't ride on the same train car, which made things pretty awkward in New Orleans because, believe it or not, New Orleans had a pretty substantial free black population. But what is also interesting about New Orleans that we've discussed over time? As far as the city. Anybody? Nobody? New Orleans is a multicultural, multi-ethnic city. Is that the direction you were going in? So you've got like French, Spanish, Native American, African American, English, heritage all interwoven together. This is a very weird law to be passed in 1890, but they decided to test it. Homer Plessy purposely gets on an all-white car. They even hired the detective that is going to arrest him to challenge the law. Conductor on the train stops him. He explains what he's doing. The detective arrests him, and now they have grounds to challenge this. So the judge that ruled against him in Louisiana is John Ferguson. This goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. In an unbelievably horrible decision that ranks right up there with Dred Scott, the court will rule that Jim Crow did not violate the 14th Amendment. Separate but equal will be American law and legacy for the next 70 years. This will not be overturned until Brown v. Board in 1954. So this is a theme that should stay with us for pretty much the rest of the course. Tragically, after Plessy, Jim Crow begins to spread both north and west. So remember, Jim Crow is not real. Jim Crow is a character from a minstrel show from before the Civil War. But this cartoon up here shows the separate but equal. It's separate, but it's not equal. And every type of service that you can think of, schools, shopping centers, transportation, even water fountains were segregated. Hey, thank you. Appreciate it. All right, do you guys have any questions up to this point? All right. Class conflicts and ethnic conflicts at the end of Reconstruction. One of the largest labor uprisings in the late 1800s occurred right at the end of Reconstruction. In 1877, presidents of 4 of the nation's most powerful railroads decided collectively that they were going to cut their workers' wages by 10% or more. This will lead to Rutherford B. Hayes, who's president, sending in U.S. military to put down the labor strike. This is a first in U.S. history. This labor strike was widespread. It was all over the country. Are y'all familiar with where Winchester, Virginia is? Just north of Winchester in West Virginia is Martinsburg, West Virginia. That's where this labor strike started. By the end of the summer, there were like 100 people dead from the uprising. But the uprising was ultimately squashed by the government and by the railroad companies. Another problem here, though, is that as all this railroad development is happening, there also becomes racial tension throughout the nation, especially in the West. So the Transcontinental Railroad is being built right after the end of the Civil War. One line goes from Omaha to Utah. The other line goes from Sacramento, California to Utah. The rail line from Omaha to Utah is predominantly built by African Americans, Civil War veterans, both North and South, and Irish immigrants. How do you think things went between those groups? Not great. There was constant class violence going on in that portion of building the railroad. It's even worse on the West Coast, because on the West Coast, that line from Sacramento to Utah is predominantly being built by Irish and Chinese immigrants. And the Irish and the Chinese start to have conflict. And an Irishman in San Francisco, Dennis Kearney, starts the Workmen's Party. And ultimately, this isn't just about getting laws passed. This is like violence in the street between Irish laborers and Chinese laborers. Why are the Chinese coming over? For what? For work, for freedom, for land. Why are the Irish coming over? For work, for freedom, for land. This is just a race riot that breaks out on the West Coast in the name of labor. This will ultimately lead to the proposal. Yep, this will lead to the proposal of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now, Rutherford B. Hayes blocks it, doesn't participate in it, because America had a treaty with China that allowed for Chinese immigrants to come over. But once that treaty expired, the Chinese Exclusion Act will be passed in 1882 by President Chester A. Arthur, which will be the first law in American history that is an anti-immigrant law based on ethnicity. We're not done with this. We're going to talk more about this as we move forward. All right. So, our 20th and 21st presidents, James Garfield and Chester A. Arthur. Garfield, absolutely brilliant. Civil War general for the Union Army. Where are my mathematicians at? Any math people? No one? Hey, Garfield, we got one. Garfield is our only U.S. president to successfully solve the Pythagorean theorem. He taught mathematics at Hiram University in Ohio. He is what we would consider a moderate Republican. He would have fallen into that category of the half-breeds. But he's going to run against a really major opponent, and that's going to be Democratic candidate Winfield Scott Hancock, who had been a hero of what battle? Where he held the center line of this battle on its third day. Gettysburg. He was like the hero of Gettysburg. So, that means the Republican Party needs to balance their ticket. They are going to choose Chet Arthur, who was a stalwart. So they have a half-breed and a stalwart on the same ticket to try to secure the Republican vote. And they win. And Garfield makes a promise, a campaign promise, that he is against the spoil system. He believes that government jobs should be based on merit. Well, within a few months of him taking office, he's going to his college reunion, and as he's trying to board a train to leave D.C. to go to his college reunion, he's shot in the back by a disgruntled office seeker by the name of Charles Guiteau. Now, Guiteau will plead insanity, but will ultimately be convicted and executed for the assassination. Garfield dies months later. They end up taking him to Atlantic City to try to recover, and it doesn't work out. If he had better medical care, he probably could have survived. So enter Chester A. Arthur. Arthur had absolutely no intention of becoming president. But a lot gets done for how little the guy actually worked. And I'll explain why here in a minute. So Arthur was a man of leisure. He was a man of fashion. Are y'all familiar with Brooks Brothers? He had an exclusive deal with Brooks Brothers. He loved to hunt. He loved to fly fish. He also enjoyed napping. In fact, he went fly fishing in a three-piece suit. Kind of interesting. See, bud? So, a lot actually gets accomplished in his 3.5-year term. So, he passes the Chinese Exclusion Act into law, barring Chinese immigration to America. He will also do a reversal from the Stalwarts, which was the group that got him involved in politics. He shocks his base by passing the Pendleton Act into law in 1883. This was the Magna Carta of civil service. What this basically did was it made all government jobs merit-based. You had to be qualified. You weren't put into a position because of who you knew. Does all this sound familiar? Does some of this feel like a reboot? Right? There's a lot of parallels from then and now. Okay? Arthur also set up the Civil Service Commission, which was a commission to basically overview appointees to political not to political office, but to government positions. He also revitalized the U.S. Navy. This is when the Navy moves from what to what. Better question. What did the U.S. Navy during the Civil War move from what to what? Help me out. I'll give you a hint. March 9th, 1862. Hampton Roads. Very good. So we move from wood to what? Iron. Arthur moves the Navy from iron to steel. Very good. Excellent job. All right, how am I doing over there?
2 minutes, 3 seconds.
Beautiful. So, we have Grover Cleveland, and we have Benjamin Harrison. The reason I have 22, 23, and 24, Grover Cleveland is our first president to win non-consecutive terms. He is also the only Democrat in this era. He is also the only one in the era that was not a Civil War veteran from the Union Army. So he comes in and basically says, I am going to absolutely gut the federal government. Does this sound familiar? When he comes into office, he fires 2/3 of the federal workforce. He will also restrict military pensions for Civil War vets. How do you think that went over? Not great. But there was a bit of a problem in this era. The Civil War vets are getting quite old, and there's a lot of young women trying to marry old Civil War vets to secure pensions. It's pretty strange. Strange time in American history. I guess every time in American history is strange. Anyhow, he actually ends up with a surplus of $145 million. He also is going to push forth the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC. This is the first government commission in U.S. history to try to regulate the railroad. How do you think that went? It did not go hardly at all. It was a whole lot of bark and very little bite. The railroads were so powerful at this period of time, they were very hard to control. Okay? Bless you. He will be our only president to date, and I don't know if this will happen again, to get married as president. He got married in the White House. I'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward today. And as he's leaving, after he's defeated in 1888, his young bride says, don't change too much around here. We'll be back. Well, they were. So in 1888, in one of the closest elections in American history, ranking with 1824 and 1876 and 2000, Benjamin Harrison, grandson of William Henry Harrison, squeaks by Grover Cleveland. Harrison comes in, he's an imperialist. Any idea what he tried to annex, but any idea what he tried to annex, but it didn't work out until later? That's a good guess, but no. Already happened. Yeah. Hawaii. He starts the process of the annexation of Hawaii, but it's stalled. It won't come to fruition until the presidency of McKinley. He is going to pass the McKinley tariff, which will raise tariffs on imported goods by 50%. He passes the Sherman Antitrust Act, which is America's first attempt at trying to regulate the monopolies, but there are way too many loopholes, and there's absolutely nothing that bars the monopolies from price fixing. So a lot of bark, very little bite. But what really sinks him is the $1 billion Congress. He takes that surplus and he just spends and expands the government yet again. Now America goes into a what? It will, but before that it goes into a deficit. We're headed toward a panic. And guess who inherits it? Grover Cleveland. He is reelected to a non-consecutive term, and boom, almost immediately coming into office, he's got the Panic of 1893 in his lap. There is only one to date economic depression worse than this one. The Great Depression. Yeah. And then one thing that really does him in, he pretty much has to do a deal with the devil. Y'all heard of J.P. Morgan before? Yeah? He has to appeal to Morgan to help bail the country out. Morgan says, sorry, you don't have enough collateral. One guy tells the President of the United States that the U.S. does not have enough collateral. Eventually, they convince him to do it. What does he get in return? Then he will be able to cash out later and get even wealthier. Bonds. Very good. This is going to undo Cleveland. Also, the Democratic Party splinters, excuse me, in this era, and he does not seek re-election. Could he have sought re-election for a third term? Yeah, for sure. The 22nd Amendment doesn't exist yet, but he does not seek re-election. So I've got some interesting political cartoons. On the top left, we have Charles Guiteau, the guy that assassinated Garfield, An Office or Your Life. Top right, Chet Arthur, shown as this princely figure riding in a coach. It says The Progress of Snobbery. Bottom left, one of the greatest scandals of this era. Grover Cleveland had a child out of wedlock with a mistress prior to his presidency, and the child was put up for adoption, and the woman was actually placed in an asylum. It's very scandalous and very horrible. And then he remarries this much younger woman, and they have a very famous child. Her name was Ruth, and everybody in the country called her Baby Ruth. And we believe that's where the name of the candy bar came from, or from what up-and-coming baseball player in the early 1900s? Babe Ruth, right? This is often debated. And then the Great American Mugwump is making fun of the Democrat that is a fence sitter with their lump on one side and their mug on the other. And then on the right, we have Benjamin Harrison dumping the Grover Cleveland's surplus into a black hole. And he's always in these political cartoons wearing this big hat, and they called it Granddaddy's hat because the only reason he was in politics was because of his grandfather. But it's not like his grandfather had any type of like major presence in the presidency because he died of pneumonia. All right, so that's where I pumped the brakes today. I got a couple of other things I want to do with you guys before we call it a day.